What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over how to create our own custom REST resource in Salesforce. Alright guys, so today we're going to go over how to create your own REST resource in Salesforce. And, why you'd want to create a REST resource, what a REST resource is, and then I'll show you, after we actually create the REST resource, how you can connect to that REST resource using Postman. So, let's get to it. I'll start with what I typically start with, which is why would you ever create your own REST resource in Salesforce, right? There is the REST API, there's the SOAP API that Salesforce just provides to you, and you can, connect to your org that way and get the data you need. So why would you ever create your own REST resource for an external system to get data from you? There are a ton of answers to this question. I'm probably not even going to scratch the surface of all the ones that are potentially available out there, but I'll give you a couple examples of the reasons I've used them in the past. REST resources, one of the most common reasons I've used them is because of one of two things. Number one, there is the external system that is connecting to Salesforce either does not have the ability, or the team doesn't want to, translate their data into a format that Salesforce can understand before it processes the data. So instead what they do is they connect to the REST resource. The REST resource takes, maybe a JSON object or XML, or sometimes it's even weirder stuff like pipe delimited text. And the REST resource formats that data and then sends it to the appropriate Salesforce objects. It can also be that the kind of the reverse of that. If I am the connecting system and I want to pull data from Salesforce, I'm not wanting to do the data transformation on my side. I'm expecting you, Salesforce, to transform all this data into whatever format the external system needs it in, right? Maybe in the external system, an account and a contact are stored in the same table. That would be horrible. I don't think you should do that, but maybe that's the case, right? So in Salesforce, you'd merge that account and that contact into the same, entity, and then when the other place called to grab that data, they would get that merged version of the account and contact. The second most common thing are like weird security requirements. And this is not necessarily something I would advocate for, but there has been a couple times in the past where I've created a REST resource primarily because somebody didn't want to pay for multiple licenses to have multiple connections to Salesforce, right? Normally, when you're creating an external connection to Salesforce, you create a user for them. That user gets to authenticate, and you can set up profiles and permissions for that user and restrict things that way. That said, sometimes people just want to share a user for all of their external systems to save on cost, or because they're low on licenses. And I've used REST resources to kind of determine who's accessing the system and what data they should be served. So I don't know that Salesforce would condone that, but those are the two most common reasons that I've used them. There are plenty of other reasons though. So anytime you need something custom that the REST REST API or the SOAP API doesn't support, you'll probably come down this route, potentially anyway. So those are the two big things. The other thing I want to go over is just what a REST resource is. Basically, you have this URL. Let me see. It's going to be different for your org. But this URL is what you're going to connect to. This is essentially the endpoint for your org, right? You've got my domain, coding with the force, deved.my.salesforce.com, services, Apex REST, and what we're going to create is a resource on this endpoint to be able to grab our whatever, right? So this just kind of small example that I have in front of you, if I was using it, I'd slap that on the end of it, and I'd be able to do whatever actions I had available on account.dml. But basically, a REST resource is a subset of an endpoint, which is a weird way to basically say something that describes what you are trying to retrieve or update or whatever else. So, you know, say for instance, instead of this URL mapping, which is actually kind of a terrible one, this was users, right? There's tons of APIs out there that allow you to take a look at user information. So maybe this was users. And I had a post method in here that was, or a get method rather, that was, I don't know, global static list of users, get users, right? And I've got nothing but, yeah. But this REST resource describes what I am, you know, trying to deal with, I suppose, as the external system. So whenever you name these REST resources, you know, make sure that they are some kind of noun, typically a noun or a person, place, or thing that you are giving your users access to, or your external systems access to. But that's effectively what it is. It's just a descriptor that informs people connecting to you what they should intend to retrieve from your resource, right? Your REST resource. This resource gives me users, but another resource could give me accounts, or it could give me, who knows? I don't know. Yeah, I'll put a little more information in the description to go over more of the difference between a REST resource and an endpoint and all that kind of stuff. Can't say that's necessarily the point of this video, but I wanted to go over it really quick because it is an important distinction. It's not an endpoint, it's a resource for your endpoint. Cool. Okay, so now that we've gone over that, let's create a class together and just kind of figure out how all of this stuff works. So we'll create a new Apex class, and we'll just call it I don't know, users REST resource or something along those lines. And I'll zoom in here. Okay, the first thing that we have to do, if we're exposing an Apex class to the outside world, you have to declare it as global. So REST resources are built and created for external systems to basically talk to your Salesforce instance. If you want that to happen, you have to declare your class and any methods that external systems might connect to as global. And we'll go over that second point a little more in just a minute. After we do that, however, we are going to want to do the following, which is create annotate this class with a REST resource tag, and we need to give this a URL mapping. I'm doing too much JavaScript recently, doing double quotes. What am I thinking? Anyway, all right, so what this does is it is informing Salesforce effectively that you would like this class to become a resource for your org's endpoint, right? So we're going to now have a new resource that's available in your org for external systems to connect to, and it's going to what is available will be determined by this class. Now, as far as what you fill out in URL mapping, you can fill this out pretty much however you want. You'll want to slash whatever it is you want your resource to be named. Again, ideally you want it to be named something like a noun, right? And a noun, if you don't know, is a person, a place, or a thing. So you've got users. In this case, we're going to be serving user data through this REST resource. And it is important to note that whatever you put in here is case sensitive. So if you use a capital U and then you try to connect with just a lowercase u, it won't work. Again, we'll go over that in a little bit, but very important to know that that URL mapping is case sensitive when you start to try to connect to it later. The other thing that is important to go over is if you wanted to pass URL parameters into your REST resource, which is a very popular thing, a very common thing to have happen, then you will put another slash on the end here and then a star. And what that basically allows you to do is add as many parameters to the end of this URL as you want, and be able to parse them or whatever else. So as long as somebody connects to or has users in here and calls out to your org using that user's resource, even if you pass a dozen parameters in, it'll still figure out what you're trying to do and actually make the call appropriately. So pretty important to know if you want to do that, and I imagine many of you will want to do that. I will hopefully get to show you how to deal with parameters, but it's not exactly the point of this, so we'll see how much time I've got left when we get through this. All right, so when you create a REST resource, you will want to determine the methods in which you're allowing the external systems to call in and do things, right? So those methods, the methods that you have available anyway, are get, delete, patch, post, and put. Typically, as we'll see here in a second, you can actually, it doesn't really matter whether you annotate things with HTTP get or post or whatever, because you get to determine what actually happens in your Apex methods. But if you're being a responsible person developing these, if you're going to create a getter method, an HTTP get resource, you typically want to give somebody data, right? They're calling you to get data, you want to return data. If you're doing delete, people are typically using that method to be able to delete something. So they're going to probably pass in data and you're going to delete it. Hopefully you do that. Patch, I believe is I always get these two mixed up, but I believe patch is the one where you're just updating something. Post is typically when you're wanting to insert new data, and put is when you either want to insert or update data. Pretty positive it's that one. It's patch or put, but I'm pretty sure put is the one where it's either insert or update, typically. Anyway, so let's just create a getter method and see what happens. So we'll do HTTP get, and we will create a global method. So we'll say go global static list of users. and we'll say get users. And at this point, we can really do whatever we want. Salesforce isn't going to hold us to any standards. So if, typically when people are using a get method to connect to your resource, they're wanting to have data sent back to them. But, Salesforce isn't going to say you've got to, right? If you want to return nothing, you can return nothing. You shouldn't. It's going to really infuriate whoever's connecting to you. You could also insert data or delete data or whatever else. Again, probably not something you should do in this method if it's an HTTP GET method, but it's definitely something you could do. You just shouldn't do. But typically what you would do in an HTTP GET method is you would, basically go out and grab some data and return it to whatever is calling you. And limit 10. Okay, and then you just say return users. And what this will do at this point is if somebody's going to connect to you and they call this and they use a GET request, what's going to happen is they're going to retrieve these users, whatever 10 users randomly get pulled here. Now, what's extremely common for getters especially, is you are often going to want to take a look at what's in the URL parameters. Typically, URL parameters get passed in and you append that to a query or whatever else. It might not be the case. You might actually have something passed into the method here. But let's just take a look at it. I said we'd maybe get to URL parameters, and we're getting there even faster than I expected. So let's just take a look. Basically, nope, that's not what I want. You have an enormous amount of data that you can actually access from this class or from this method. So we know, right, that this class is going to be, and this method more specifically, is going to be accessed by an external system who's connecting via a REST request. And since we know that, we can grab data from our REST context, as in this moment in time, this person's connected to us, they passed this URL and did whatever else to actually connect to us, right? So now that we have this REST request context variable, we can actually get quite a bit of data. So we can get the URI, we can get the body of the request, we can get the headers of the request, parameters, the method that was actually used, which should be a GET, to be able to access this method. But more importantly, right, you can get your parameters. And for now, just so we can see what gets returned to us and figure out how to work with it here in a bit, we'll just debug it. But you can get parameters pretty easily and be able to do unique things with your query. Now, it is extremely important if you do this to make sure that you prevent SQL injection. If you are using request parameters, URL parameters at all, make sure once you get these parameters and you start actually using them that you use the escape single quotes method, right? This makes sure that they can't use what's called SQL injection. I'm not going to go over SQL injection, but if you build one of these and you do not use this at the very least to prevent against SQL injection, you might get in trouble eventually. So make sure to do that if you're using parameters at all, because people can pass malicious things in that you wouldn't expect. People who are smart and do very dangerous things with the data in your org. So just be careful. All right, so we've got this HTTP GET. When we go to Postman in a little bit, I'll show you how to connect to this and get this data. But let's go over really quick our other options and actually create a post method. So we've got our HTTP post method. Typically when you use a post method when connecting to a REST endpoint, what you're wanting to do is create something new, right? So maybe that person wants to, or entity rather, that's connecting to you wants to be able to create a new user. So what we'll do is yet again create a global static and maybe we'll just return a I'm gonna return nothing for the time being, but maybe you return a string to inform them that they have successfully, actually I'm gonna do that, and we'll say insert user. And what we'll do here is actually pass in a user. We'll call it new user. And to keep this short and simple, we're just going to insert that new user and then return new user.id. And this method parameter is going to be passed in the body of the post method, right? Which we'll go over in a little bit, but I'll show you exactly how that works. So, okay, we have a couple things set up. I think you have the general idea of how you need to set up these classes and why you need to set them up. Everything that is supposed to be available to via your REST resource should be global. So class is global, those methods are global. That's not to say you couldn't have private methods in here. You could certainly have private static methods in here that do auxiliary things like I don't know, prep account or user for insertion or something. You can definitely have those methods in here, but if they're annotated, then and you intend to connect to them, they need to be global and static. So definitely make sure you do that. All right, now that we have this done, let's go on ahead and save this class and hope that it works. You never know. Apparently I've broken something. Duplicate URL mapping on user. Oh, right, because I was using this as an example and I saved it, I guess. Okay, now we'll save this and we should be good to go. So the next thing that we're going to actually do is open up our Salesforce instance and create a connected app. So what we'll do over here is type in app manager and we'll bring up the app manager and we will click this button up here in the top right corner called new connected app. And we will call this I don't know, REST resource example, but you can call this whatever you want. It doesn't really matter at all. And I'll give it my coding with the force at gmail.com. Okay, cool. And then we'll click enable OAuth settings because that's important. You don't need to enable for device flow because chances are a TV or something like a TV is not accessing this, so don't worry about it. Callback URL. This should basically be the following. I mean, this can actually be a number of things, but typically what I end up using is your my domain, services, OAuth 2, callback. This is just a callback URL that your org basically provides to you by default. So again, structure of that is your my domain, then the word services, OAuth 2, callback. Cool. We don't need to use digital signatures. You certainly could. It depends on your security needs or preferences, but I don't think we do here, at least not for this example. And the only thing I believe you need is access and manage your data via the API. So there are a lot of tutorials out there that tell you to just use full access. Don't do that. You don't need to do that. And so don't. That's opening up way more data in your org than you need to places accessing your system. You should always require a secret for web server flow. You should always require a secret for a refresh token. The rest of this stuff is fine to leave as is. So we'll save it. It's going to tell us that it takes 10 minutes to take effect. Typically it actually doesn't take 10 minutes, but it's normally like 1 or 2, but Salesforce says it to be safe. Anyway, we'll hit continue, and as long as we filled everything out right, we will come to this screen. Now, one thing that you may need to do once you're on this screen, first things first, you will want to copy this consumer key and the secret. I'm not going to blur any of this like so many people do in their videos, because I'm just going to delete this app by the time you see it, so it doesn't really matter to me if you're looking at this right now. So, but you should never make these, especially the secret, and that, like, if you create a connected app, make sure you protect these in very safe places. Don't expose these to other people or end users. Only give the place that is attempting to connect to you, that external system, that team, your secret, right? And they should hopefully be storing it appropriately. You never know, but hopefully they are. And then I always get this mixed up. I think you click the manage button. Yes. And hit edit policies. Now, I'm going to switch this to admin approved users are pre-authorized, but you may want to actually use users. All users may self-authorize. This is very dependent on what you're setting up. I'm going over a lot of connected app stuff that is not necessarily part of this video, but it is important because somebody's going to connect to your REST resource eventually. And then as far as enforce IP restrictions, this really depends. Sometimes you want to do this, sometimes you would prefer not to. For this video, I'm going to relax my IP restrictions so that this is a little easier to get through, but definitely be wary of both of these things, the users that are permitted and then the IP relaxation. Yes, so let's hit save here. These are two important things that you need to set up, and what you actually do here may differ based on your security requirements. I'm just setting it up this way so I can show you really easily in Postman how to connect to things. And then because I've done this admin approved users are pre-authorized, what I can do down here now, before this actually wasn't available, but now I can do manage profiles, and I can say, in a real world scenario, I'd find my API user profile and select them as the one that could do it, but I'm going to give myself the system administrator profile access. Cool. All right. There's obviously a lot more to connected apps. I'm not going to go over everything, but that's how we're going to set it up for this demo so that we can figure out how to connect in Postman. So let's go over to Postman and actually connect to our REST resource. So if you don't know what Postman is, you can go to postman.com and download it. But basically what it is an application that allows you to, well, it actually allows you to do way more than what I'm about to explain, but it allows you to really easily kind of test your new API, right? Well, whatever your API that you've built is. In our case, it's just a REST resource that we've created, but it makes it really simple to go out and test, set up a quick test of your API and figure out whether or not, it's working as anticipated, if you're getting the responses that you think you should get, all that kind of stuff. So without having to write a bunch of code to go out and integrate with something, you can just use this simple tool that will allow you to make these call outs to external systems or whatever else really easily. So definitely check it out. And if you're doing an integration of any kind or setting up a REST resource in Salesforce, definitely use this before you start handing off your REST resource to whatever team for the other system that's integrating with Salesforce starts to try to use it. Test your own code first. It's a nice thing to do. Anyway, so once you've got it installed, this is what Postman looks like. I already have a few example Postman callouts set up, and that's mostly so I, again, do not waste your time. We'll build these together. Don't worry. So I've got a post example, a get example, and then an auth request, because you have to authorize yourself first before you can actually reach out to your REST resource. So let's figure out how to do that. The first thing that you need, if you don't have it, is your consumer key and your consumer secret for your connected app that we just made. So definitely copy these down, or at least keep this up so that you can copy them over in just a second. The second thing you'll need is a user, hopefully an API user, not just some random system admin. In my case, it's just going to be me because this is my dev org and I'm keeping it simple. But you'll want some user. So you'll want their data, their username, their password, security token. And then what you will do is create a new auth request. And so to do that in Postman, you'll click this Create New button and click this request. And I actually have already done this, but to make things easier, I always create collections. They're basically just like folders of requests. So, consider creating a collection to do that, or click that new collection up here, one or the other, it doesn't really matter, and just name it something useful. I've named mine REST Resource Demo. You can name yours whatever you want. And then so we'll create a new request, and we'll say authorization request. Again, does not matter at all what you name that. And we will put it in our collection that we've made. You don't have to do that either if you don't want to, but after you've selected your collection or opted to not create a collection, then we'll just save it. And we will first grab this URL from over here. So we'll grab that, we'll bring it over here, drop it in here, switch this to a post request because that's what we need it to be. The way that this URL is structured is your my domain, and then the word services, and then OAuth, and then token. This part here never changes. It's just this part that is your my domain that you'll use. If you don't use a my domain, which I think is actually going to be mandated here soon, you could use login or test.salesforce.com. But anyway, we'll just stick with the my domain. All right, then we're going to head over to the body section of this authorization request and put in form data. And in here, we're going to do a bunch of things. So in the body here, we're going to create a content type, or create a key called a content type. We'll create one called grant type. Oh, not that. We'll do another one called username, password, security token, maybe, client ID, client secret, so many things to pass in, and that looks like everything, so we'll see if it is everything. And then we'll head over here, and we're just going to drop in all of this information. Let's see. So for content type, we need application form URL encoded. For grant type, it should be password. For username, this should be your username. Looks like I needed underscores instead of hyphens, so that's important. So we'll change these to underscores. The fun stuff, the really, really fun stuff to test what we just built is what we're doing right now. Okay. Client ID, client secret, security token. Okay, I think we're good. All right. So we'll put that in there. Put your password in. Security token. And let's see. Client ID and client secret. Oh, all right. And once you've got all of that stuff in the body of your post request here for your authorization, you can hit send, and hopefully it gives you this response back. This is what you need, basically. Nothing else in here, at least at this moment in time, matters except for this access token. So just grab this bad boy. Save it somewhere, and hang on to it for a bit. And let's go on ahead and create a new GET request. So let's just drag this bad boy over to this other one that I've already done to make this easier. So let me grab this URL and put it over here. So what this URL structure is again your my domain, and these parts are always going to remain the same: services, Apex REST, and then everything after that is based on your REST resource. So if you remember, when I created my REST resource, created it with the URL users. And so here you can see I'm using users. And I'm also passing in some URL parameters so that we can take a look at those URL parameters that we set up earlier, right? Just to see how they come in and you can use them. So basically, there's two other things that we need to do before we actually click send here. We need to, in the headers area, type authorization, and then type in bearer space, and take that access token that we just received. If I can copy it again, we'll see. There it is. And drop it in here. And now that we have that, we should be able to hit save or send. And you can see it returned us a list of users, which is pretty cool. And if I open up the developer console, we can actually take a look at our parameters and see that they got passed in. This is probably hard to see. There you go. As Bob equals no, Taco equals hi. So it comes in as a map, and you can easily access data in that map. Again, all we did was do REST request and then ask for the parameters. Just to reiterate it again, if you do use parameters and you use them in SOQL queries, please make sure to use the escape single quotes to prevent SOQL injection. All right, moving on. So we've figured out how to connect to it for our HTTP GET, right? And you can see that just by setting this to GET, we were able to call the GET method appropriately, which is great news. The next thing that we'll do is create yet another request, and we'll do the post request now because, again, we created this HTTP post one. So let's figure out how to talk to things. I will grab this URL again because I need the same one. I'm going to drop the URL parameters, although you could send them to this one too, but we're not looking at anything there. And then we're going to head over to headers again, do a content type of JSON, and again do an authorization key in the header, and we'll just drop this guy in here yet again. Cool. Now, we need a way to actually pass in a user, right? And this is where it gets kind of weird. If you are expecting this new user to come in as a parameter, you basically send it as a, well, you could send it in several different formats, but for this, we're going to send it in JSON format because that's what we declared the content type as. And we're going to click this raw button and make sure this is in JSON, not HTML or XML or whatever else. And we are going to do the following. We're going to drop this in here, and I'm going to explain how this works. So, this is a JSON object. I do not know if I can zoom in here. That'll have to do. Okay, so we've got this JSON object, and you can see it's named new user, which seems weird. Why isn't it just like a regular user JSON? That's because you can see we named our variable new user. So whatever you named your variable is what your JSON object should start with, basically, that you're passing into your post method. And then for us, our object is a user, so we want to pass in a bunch of user fields. So I'm doing last name, setting it to chocolate, alias, blah, blah, blah. Now, it occurs to me that now that we're doing this, that this isn't really going to work because I have to assign a profile ID and a role ID and all that kind of stuff. So for simplicity's sake, let's just make sure that we actually did indeed pass what it thinks anyway is a user. And we'll say this is a user. And we'll say new user, right? Should send me back an error because I'm not filling out all the required fields for a user. So we'll check this out. So we've got everything set up now that we need to set up, and let's hit send. And you can see it did indeed send me an error. It said insert failed, first exception, required missing fields for all these different things. but we can at least see in the dev console whether or not it treated it as a user. And it did, as you can see, create a user object. So that's great, right? We sent in our JSON and it was received and treated as a user after we did that. So that's great news. I think that's most of the most important things that I should go over in this video. If you are connecting to put or patch or delete, you do the exact same things, except for you change this to put or patch or delete and pass in whatever data you needed to pass in your body, right? So in the body that we set up here, that might be very different for whatever you do for put or patch or delete. But that said, you would do the exact same things that we just took a look at here. Yeah, I think that ought to do it. So, you know, if you guys like the video, make sure to subscribe if you want to always know when it's time to vote on the next video or when my newest video is up. Definitely hit the bell button. And back to the voting thing, if you want to see the videos that you want to see, go over to the community tab and vote for next week's video. Every week I give you the opportunity to vote, so vote. Or be sad that somebody else voted and you didn't get to see what you wanted to see. Nobody wants that, so just go vote. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.